So for the past several weeks, one commentator says this. For the past several weeks, we've been hearing stories about Jesus' ministry that the commentator said were shocking to the disciples. Actually, I would say it's totally the opposite. It's not just shocking; it's mind-blowing, right? So you have to understand, like they were, the disciples were raised with an image of God that was the Messiah was going to come and was going to take over and redeem Israel, and everything was going to be awesome, and he was going to be a king and everything, So they had this idea of what the Messiah was supposed to be. And Jesus shows up and he starts to do some of it, works some miracles, and it's like, oh, yeah, we got the right guy. Okay, this is going good. And then he says, but hold on. It means I have to be fully human. It means I have to experience the fullness of what it means to be human. That means I have to be tortured and I have to die. And they're like, holy shit. Oh, hang on. This doesn't make sense. This is not, you got it? So this is what's been happening for 4 weeks. This is what we, first what we do, 4 weeks ago we had, Jesus got into a fight with the religious scholars and about ritual washing. They told him, oh, your people don't wash right. And it's like, come on, get a life. Talk about authenticity. Let's talk about authenticity rather than what we're doing, right? That doesn't make any sense. And then the next week he heals the deaf mute, and he says to the deaf mute, and he says to everybody who's around when he heals the deaf mute, shh, don't tell anybody. And they go and tell everybody. I said the one thing about that reading that brings me a lot of joy is at least I know when I lose control of everything, it's okay, because even Jesus did. And then third, last week, right? Jesus says to the disciples, who am I? And Peter says exactly who he is. And so it's like, yep, we got the Messiah. Okay, we're back on track again. And then he says, get behind me, Satan. It's like, oh, what, rats? Come on. This is not right. And then this week, Jesus says, so, what were you talking about? Ouch, ouch. So, in that, then he brings up a child. He brings up a child. So a child, you have to understand, in Middle Eastern culture, a child, until they made their bar mitzvah, and until they were 13 or 14, they were really kind of property. They were more of a burden than they were a grace, right? So a child, and so then he brings a child into their midst, and he says, unless you become like this, and then they're like, oh man, another one, like you're ruining this whole thing. You've been breaking down and actually breaking open this whole idea of what a Messiah is, and it's not working. Now, I don't know if y'all are, you're probably old enough, this group is probably old enough to know the movie, oh man, hang on, Kathy, what's your favorite movie? Princess Bride. Y'all probably, if you know the story of the Princess Bride, and then you got this Vizzini is, the little bald guy, and he's got the giant and all that. But the bald guy, he was a Sicilian criminal, bully, mastermind, that dude. And every time they'd get into a situation which didn't fit the paradigm, do you remember what he'd say? Inconceivable. That's exactly what the disciples are running into every week. Inconceivable. This just doesn't fit, right? It doesn't fit. I think one of the greatest challenges that we still face today, one of the greatest challenges and obstacles of our journey of faith is, are we ready to admit that God is inconceivable? Are we ready to admit that we don't really understand? Are we ready to admit that sometimes you and I get tired of religion, right? And sometimes are we ready to admit that we get tired of incompetent leaders? And sometimes are we ready to admit that sometimes faith is a whole hell of a lot more work than what we thought it was going to be, right? I like the Baltimore Catechism. It's black and it's white. This was the question. This is the answer. It's simple. It's done. But God says, yeah, I don't fit that. Sorry. Inconceivable, right? Inconceivable. if we, in AA, we have a saying, yeah, okay, I'm a drunk and I'm in recovery, but in AA we have a saying that one of the very hardest steps to make is the willingness to admit we have a problem. And to admit that, I think in that very first step of AA, it says, we admitted that we were powerless over alcohol and that our lives had become unmanageable. And I really think as people of faith, that's what Jesus is inviting us into, is to admit that we really know so little about God, that really we probably understand a minute particle of it. I even said that in the opening prayer, right? A minute particle. Maybe if we were to rewrite the first step for us as Christians living in the world today, we might say, we admitted that we really don't understand God and that life will be a constant struggle in discovering and understanding this amazing and mind-blowing God in whom we believe. That might be our first step. But I think, my friends, the really most important first thing that we have to remember is exactly what every AA person will tell you, and that's the very first word of those first steps. And the very first word of the first step is we. It's we. You see, my friends, the journey of faith is a journey of we together. It's us who make up the body of Christ. I often say to people, I've heard it said, let me say that. I've heard it said that, like, Mass is boring because we do the same thing every week. You know, you bring up the gift, you do the opening song, you do it, whatever, you do the same. The reason we do the same thing, my friend, is not magic. It's because our history has told us if we do these things, we know that people have encountered God. Now, it's not magic, but it might be the same thing. We always get name tags. It might be somebody greeting us at the door. It might be something about the Eucharist. It might be the sign of peace where we meet God. It might be in a smile. It might be in a song that we sing, and all of a sudden a verse goes, wow, I never thought about it that way. It might be, God forbid, it might be in a homily. Like you might remember, that's inconceivable. So the encounter of God might just happen that way, and we gather each and every week in the sure and the certain hope that our presence and the presence of each other, whether we're online, so thank you for being with us, or whether we're here in person, that presence is where we encounter God. It's in our relationships with each other. Ingrid, your party last night, it's all about relationships, right? And that those encounters happen in big ways and they happen in small ways. So every Mass isn't like an aha moment and like transformative for our lives. You know, sometimes it's boring. Okay, you know, welcome to God. So many of you might have heard this, but I think the story bears repeating because the child example that Jesus meant or that gave us today was really impactful. So my 2 and 3.5-year-old grandson is back there. I happened to watch him one morning. It was a few months ago, right at springtime, right? So Declan and I are at springtime, and he says, "Papa, outside." So I said, "Okay, well, you got to get your hat and your gloves and because it was still cold, right?" I said, "Get your hat, your gloves, your shoes, get everything on, and we'll go outside." So he goes around the house. He gets all of his stuff, gets his shirt, gets his pants, gets his socks and shoes and hat and gloves and all that stuff. And we go to stand by the door, and we walk up to the door, and I look down, and I said, "Declan, your shoes are on the wrong feet." And he got this most concerned look on his face, and he looks up at me, and he looks down, and he looks back up, looks back down, and he looks back up, and he says, "No, Papa, those are my feet." Okay, what that taught me, I really think that was a religious lesson, and I really kind of opened up my brain to that. The reality is that for him, those were his feet, and that's what I said. It's a different perspective. Is left right or is right left? Right? I don't know. And maybe as an adult, I don't have it all figured out. Because I was like, okay, hell, let's go play. I really believe that what Jesus was trying to do is to get us to encounter a God in new ways, and maybe in ways that we didn't think we could possibly encounter God, right? I believe that Jesus was trying to get the disciples to admit that maybe right is left and left is right. I believe that Jesus was trying to get the disciples to let go of those preconceived notions, and maybe us to let go of our preconceived notions of what an encounter with God is supposed to be. So everyone possibly knows this exercise, and I'm going to just invite you to do this really quick. Just without thinking, cross your arms. Okay. Now, and just note which way it is. I'm going to invite you to do it the other way. Feels a little uncomfortable, doesn't it? Doesn't it? And we know, and you know, Cassie uses this all the time, but it's a bit uncomfortable. Now, say you're coming up to communion. What are you going to do? You receive Eucharist, okay? Do that action for me, however you do it. Now do it the opposite. Okay. This week, what I'm going to ask you to do is do everything the opposite of what you think, right? Every time you encounter a thought about God and it's this way, look at what the opposite might be. And ask yourselves, I wonder if God isn't inviting me to look at it from a different perspective. More like, yeah, those are my feet, right? Maybe what God's asking us to do is to change our paradigms so that the paradigm might change our heart. And if it can change our heart, then we can change the world. Amen?